So if you weren't there, that's what some of the things you missed out on. If you were, you got to see lots of pictures and things like that, and evidence to be used in the future, probably. All right, good to see everybody. Thanks for coming out. As always, open up your booklets, please, to lesson number 16. Is that right?
15.
Is it 15? Thank you. Yep, 15. You were exactly right. That's right. We're exactly halfway through tonight. Halfway through on February the 1st. All right. Have a Bible handy. We'll open up to some things here in a moment. Let's just review a little bit just to catch us up of where we've been. Who is the first king over Israel? First king, Landry?
Saul.
It was Saul, all right? So, Saul is king. By the way, why did the children of Israel get a king? Landry?
Because everybody else in their land had a king.
Yeah, peer pressure, basically, right? Everybody around them had a king. Now, who were the people around them?
All the Canaanites they didn't kill that God wanted them.
There you go. Now we're starting to connect some dots, right? So that's one of the reasons that God said, get rid of everybody in Canaan, right? So that you don't have some of those negative influences, paganism and things like that. Well, they wiped out a lot of them, but then some of them they captured, had as slaves. Some of them they married and had families with, so obviously kind of disobedient to God. And so then we went from Saul, and then Saul had the prophet Samuel, was kind of his partner, his cohort, helping him with the kingdom and so forth, communicating the things of God to him. And then at one particular war was going to have a battle, and they're waiting for Samuel to come down and pray for the people so they'd be successful. And Samuel didn't show up when he said he was, and what did Saul do instead? Anybody remember? So Samuel didn't show up. And Joe?
Did the offering himself.
He did the offering, so he acted as pastor, right? And so he took on the role of priest, technically, and Samuel then shows up and goes, that's not your job. You're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to trust me, wait on me. And really what it was God saying, you got to trust me. Not Samuel, but Samuel's God's spokesman. So Saul falls out of graces of God, and then God says, I'm going to anoint a new king. Who's the new king? David, very good. So David becomes king. Now, before David was king, there's some pretty cool stories about David, right? David kills Goliath. That's well before he's king. David's victorious in battle. Well before he's king. He starts to kind of work for Saul. And when they would ride into town, the military winners and wiping out the Philistines and all the different Hittites and Girgasites and all these people, they'd ride in and people would start to cheer for him because they're pretty excited that we're winning. And they would say, Saul won and killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. So naturally, the king didn't care much to be shown up by this young upstart named David. And so Saul is pretty tortured because he's not blessed by God anymore, and he kind of doesn't go crazy, but he gets angry a lot. And so to calm him down, what would David do? You guys remember?
Play the harp.
He'd play the harp, yeah. So he'd play and he'd sing to him, and he'd kind of calm him down. And there was one instance where Saul was so angry at him, he threw a spear at him and stuck it in the wall and missed David. At that point, David kind of said, I don't think I should hang around the king anymore. And goes off, and that's when he is anointed as king and selected, and Saul kind of falls away, and Saul's sons are after David, and Saul is after David, and the race is on of who can kill who at what time. And so David is king, and then David's sons want to overthrow him. Absalom, if you remember, Absalom had some great hair, because that's how he gets caught in the tree and then eventually killed by one of David's generals. And David has a son named Solomon. What is Solomon most noted for? Landry?
His great temple.
Great temple, right? So David wanted to build a temple, but God said no, right? And then Solomon comes along and God says yes. So there was a timing for things. Even though temple is good, there was a timing. What else was he known for? Wisdom. He was claimed to be the gift from God of wisdom. He said, you're the smartest man there's ever lived or ever will live. So if you and I think, well, I would be the smartest person ever, we won't be. God says Solomon was, hands down, the smartest person in the history of man. and will be, measured against everything else. So pretty incredible to see him. And he wrote several books, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, the Proverbs, and so forth, to see some of that wisdom eke out. Now, the reason I kind of caught us up, because at the death of Solomon, there aren't any real obvious kings to rise up. Solomon does have a son, Rehoboam, and so we're going to look at him tonight. But what happens is at the end of Solomon's life, Solomon falls away from worshiping God, Yahweh. Now, can anybody tell me what was the reason that he fell away? Andrew?
Since he had 700 wives, they all worshiped different gods, so then he adapted to their religions and started worshiping other gods.
Now, you can probably understand this. I'm not giving him a pass on this, but you can understand if your husband or wife, imagine in the future, you guys are married, you imagine that if your spouse had an opinion about something, like my wife likes hamburgers, right? Now, if she likes hamburgers, I'm probably going to eat hamburgers once in a while, right? Because I'm like, she really likes it. Now, if she doesn't like liver, which I don't know anybody really that loves liver, if any of you guys know those people, God bless you, right? But if she didn't like liver, my guess is because of her, I wouldn't eat liver. Wouldn't make it at home, wouldn't have it for dinner, and so forth. So your spouse can influence you. Now, I know that Solomon had 700 wives, 300 girlfriends, and couldn't spend that much time with each of them, but obviously the time that he spent with them, if they were mostly pagan, which means they didn't worship Yahweh, worship other gods, Baal and Ashtaroth and things like that, it would eventually kind of soften him to the idea it's probably easier if we just worship some of these gods a little bit. Solomon's incredibly powerful, very wealthy, right? So you could probably sit there and go, well, let's just build a small temple to Baal, and it'll keep, 100 of my wives happy. And he kind of went, okay, so it's just a little temple. And then the other one's like, well, I want a temple for my God. You built one for them? Okay, we'll build you a little one over here. No big deal. Pretty soon you can see that influence would grow, and Solomon begins to kind of fall away from God. So after Solomon's death, the children of Israel, right, the Hebrews, it's pretty mucky, right? Some of them are worshiping God, a lot of them are worshiping other gods. They don't have a real good direction coming from the king. And so when Solomon dies, there's not an obvious heir. There's a son, Rehoboam of Solomon, who some people go, well, he's the son of the king. That's who we should follow. But some people said, but he's really going to be a lousy king. I don't want to follow him. It's kind of imagine, guys, we just went through, just a couple months ago, an election here in our country, right? What if you decided that I don't want to go with and follow the elected president, I want to go with the different guy. Maybe, former President Trump, maybe it's a brand new guy, whatever. But you can imagine what would happen in our country if you're like, well, I follow the current president, and then the person said, I follow a different guy, okay? Can't really live side by side because one makes certain rules, the other one makes different rules. So what do we find? Division. And so what happens in the Holy Land is that we get two kingdoms now. There's a split, okay? There's a north kingdom and a south kingdom, and they both have kings. So now we've taken, how many tribes? What is it? 12 tribes, and we reduce it to, believe it or not, 10 and 2. Not really even, it's not split down the middle, but that's how it breaks down. And we call them familiar names, but not based on the region, but the names of the tribes. We have Judah and we have Israel, okay? And each one of them has a king. And we're going to learn a little bit about the kings a little bit tonight. So tonight's lesson, if you look at there on page 61, tonight we're going to look at just the kingdom of the north. And then next week we'll talk about the kingdom of the south, because there's a lot to it. So we're not going to try to speed through it too rapidly. So, does that make sense? Everybody kind of caught up? Know where we are? All right, so as we get moving. All right, page 61. We're not going to talk about the time that you've had a big fight and split a relationship. Everybody could probably identify with that and see what happens, how you feel when a relationship is split between you maybe and a best friend. Maybe even if you've ever had a special friend, like I guess we call boyfriend, girlfriend. Can we call them that? Right? If you ever had one, all right, none of that. Okay, none of that. Okay. All right, under the big picture, that brown box. Would somebody volunteer to read that box for me? Ada, please.
After Solomon's death, things don't go well for God's people. Because of Solomon's sins, Israel is divided. Some people want to follow Solomon's foolish son, Rehoboam, while others want to follow Jeroboam, one of Solomon's leaders. So God's people split the promised land into two nations, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. The nation of Israel is bigger in both land and the number of tribes that belong to it, but its kings all turn away from the Lord and don't follow him. In fact, the kings of Israel all reject the one true God, setting up idols and worshiping false gods. Over the next 200 years, God keeps sending prophet after prophet to go and speak to the kings of Israel in the north, warning them of God's law and calling them to repent and be forgiven. Major prophets during this time include Elijah and Elisha, who, along with their students, warn the wicked kings of God's wrath and even perform mighty miracles where God shows his power. Yet in the end, Israel does not listen, and God sends an invading empire, the Assyrians, to conquer them. Many in the northern kingdom are either killed or exiled to faraway lands. Though the northern kingdom falls, God remains true to his people, and some kings in the southern kingdom still remain true to God in Jerusalem.
Okay, so we've got some action here. So 10 tribes are in the north, in what we call Israel. And what does that sound like? They worship other gods. God sends prophets, ones that we probably should recognize, Elijah and Elisha, to come tell them what God says, right? To straighten up and fly right. And they don't. What does that sound like that we've already studied? They worship other gods. God sends prophets to them to straighten things out. Chandler?
The cycle.
Do you remember the cycle, right, with the judges? Right? They would worship other gods. God would send a judge, or a country would sweep in and capture them, take them away. They'd complain, and God would send a judge to rescue them, and the cycle would continue. So, what I'm amazed at is when we look in the Bible, we find out that this cycle of disobedience to God is something that is really part of our sinful nature, right? And so when I look at our country, when I look at the history of this world, we've seen this cycle kind of go around and around and around. And there are times, guys, I look at our country, which is obviously most personal to us because we know it. There are times where I think that there's a time in our world right now that we're moving away from a faith in God as a whole country. Maybe not us. I hope that we're growing in our faith. But people as a whole don't necessarily gauge this world based on the Word of God. Right? When I think of some of the things that they go, hey, we think this is good or this is important, those aren't things that are necessarily laid out by God in His Word. We do have items. Ada?
One difference between this cycle of Israel and the cycle of the judges is that with the kings, there's no going back to God after they've been conquered.
Yeah, in fact, the Bible, we're going to go through it in a minute here to look kind of at the timeline. Most all of the kings, they worship other gods. They don't come back around to God. And there's consequences for it. Turn to page 62 and 63. Have that open in front of you, both together. Don't fold it over. And the reason I say that is so you can see that whole timeline. Right? That whole yellow timeline that flows through there. It starts with Jeroboam. And Jeroboam is an interesting guy. So you have Rehoboam and Jeroboam. They just happen to sound alike. And they're not related. In fact, they're no relation at all. Rehoboam, that Ada read about a moment ago, Rehoboam is the son of Solomon. But he's a really lousy leader, right? And most people believe it. However, some people are kind of tied to the fact that, but he is the king's son, so he's the right heir, okay? It's kind of like, I'm going to get kind of political here, it's kind of like when a political party, say the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, picks a candidate that we might go, why on earth did you pick them? Right? And I think we can look at that and kind of go, well, are we picking the best one? Or do they have certain characteristics that the party likes? It's not the way it was set up. The politics is set up to say, these people represent us. And I think politics have gotten corrupt enough or big enough to where they don't feel like they represent us as much as they kind of represent some ideal that they want to pursue. All right, there's my political commentary for tonight. All right. So they want a new leader because Solomon is gone. They need to have a leader. And at the very top, page 62, it says, before Solomon's death, God appointed a new leader for the 10 tribes of his people. All right? So God appointed it. So God's got his hand in this. Okay? So let's open up our Bibles to 1 Kings 11. 1 Kings 11. And when you find it in your Bible, give me a page number. 1 Kings 11. Don't be in 2 Kings. Tyler, got a page number? Give it to me.
343.
One more time.
343.
343. See if that's there. I think most of our page numbers are similar. There's a couple large print and then regular ones. But 343, try there. 1 Kings 11. Right? 1 Kings 11. And we'll start with verse 28 through 39. Let me just get there on my tablet here. It should start out the man Jeroboam. All right. So let's just read. How many do we have in here? We almost got it. Let's everybody read a verse. Parker, I'm going to start with you, and we're just going to go right around where I can see you. That's the order, right? So figure that out. Parker, go ahead.
The man Jeroboam was very able, and Solomon saw that the young man was
Industrious.
He gave him charge over all the forced laborers in the house of Joseph.
And at that time, when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem, the prophet Ahijah the Shilonite found him on the road. Now Ahijah had dressed himself in a new garment, and the two of them were alone in the open country.
Then Ahijah laid hold of the new garment that was on him and tore it into 12 pieces.
And he said to Jeroboam, take for yourself 10 pieces, for thus says the Lord, the God of Israel. Behold, I am about to tear the king's kingdom from the hand of Solomon, and will give you 10 tribes.
But he shall have one tribe for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city that I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel. Because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashtaroth, the goddess of
Sidonians. And then Chemosh.
the god of Moab, and Milcom, the god of the Ammonites. And they have not walked in my ways, doing what is right in my sight, and keeping my statutes and my rules, as David his father did.
Go ahead, Shallow. You're next. 34.
Nevertheless, I will not take the whole kingdom out of his hand, but I will make him ruler all the days of his life, for the sake of David my servant, whom I choose, who kept my commandments and my statutes.
But I will take the kingdom out of his son's hand and will give it to you, 10 tribes.
Go ahead, Eva.
I will give one tribe to his son, so that David my servant may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city where I choose to put my name.
And I will take you, and you shall reign over all that your soul desires, and you shall be king over Israel. And if you will listen to all that I command you, and will walk in my ways, and do what is right in my eyes by keeping my statutes and my commandments, as David my servant did, I will be with you, and will build you a sure house, as I built for David, and I will give Israel to you.
And I will afflict the offspring of David because of this, but not forever.
Very good. Thank you, everybody. So, just to put a couple answers down here, jot this down into that paragraph. It says, who was this man? Obviously, it's Jeroboam. Right? So, Jeroboam is the selected king. And I want you to know what his job was. He was a foreman. Right? So, write this down. He was a foreman that worked on some of Solomon's buildings. He was a foreman that worked on some of Solomon's buildings. Jeroboam. So you can imagine that he is a worker, right? But he was a really great worker. So imagine that he is the president of a construction company. And God, in a sense, through Ahijah, the prophet, chooses him to be their leader in the northern kingdom. Isn't it an interesting way how he chose which tribes would go up there. Did you guys catch that? The new material that the prophet was wearing, he's wearing a new wrap or a robe or whatever out of new material, and he took it off and he tore it in 12 pieces. And he sees Jeroboam and he says, this is a message from God. Here's 10 pieces of material. These are the tribes that you're going to lead in this kingdom here. And then 2, God is going to hold back to still be able to have in Jerusalem, which is ultimately going to be the city where the temple is built and so forth from Solomon, where the temple was built. And so that's kind of how he breaks it down. That's the beginning of this northern kingdom and who's going to lead. Down underneath in that brown box, it says, after Solomon's death, there was a big debate. People wanted to know if Solomon's son Rehoboam would make a good king or would make the same mistakes as his father. Now they knew that Solomon had followed other gods, mostly because, as Landry said, his 700 wives and 300 girlfriends, right? And because of their influence, he had stopped following God. And guys, I want you to understand that there were consequences for not following God. That's what the people were focused on. The people weren't these ultra-religious Christians that said, you're not following Yahweh, that's bad. What they realized, they're like, we're not winning wars. You know, there's famine and there's problems that are going on. When we followed God, that seemed to be things went well. They behaved very childishly, right? If you, well, let's say, for instance, that go back in time about 8 to 10 years when you'd have a babysitter, right? And somebody'd have to watch you. Now, if you had a babysitter that was really mean, right? Did things that were mean, wouldn't let you play certain things, wouldn't give you snacks or whatever else, whatever you qualify as mean, and so forth. You'd kind of wonder, what do I need to do to not get that treatment? I think that's just natural human, behavior, right? If I'm not being treated well, what should I do? I think that's something that we as people, we figure that out, right? You guys know this. Think of your teacher right now, one of your teachers, okay? You don't have to answer this, but what would you do to make your teacher happy? Right? So while your teacher is teaching, while they're conducting class, what would you do or not do to keep them in a good mood? You have something in mind. You also know what would it take to put them in a bad mood. That's kind of easier probably. Okay? The children of Israel, they're looking at this and kind of going, if Rehoboam is, or Jeroboam rather, no, if Rehoboam is the king, that's the son of Solomon, and they're like, he's going to do the same things his dad did, and when his dad was king, things were bad here. So God was kind of the parent, and kind of saying, these are not good because you're not following me, not doing the things that I'm commanding. All right, it goes on. It says, now with Jeroboam at their side, remember, Rehoboam is the son of Solomon. Jeroboam is the president, owner of the construction company, right? With him at their side, the leaders of God's people confronted the heir to the throne, Rehoboam, asking if he would make their work easier or more difficult. Okay? He's the president of a construction company. You're going to go, hey, if you're going to be our king and we're going to obey you, is our life going to be easier? Are you better than Rehoboam? We kind of have our doubts about Rehoboam. Right? Your moms and dads, if they voted in the election, they picked on who they wanted as president. Everybody agree? Right? When you vote, you're like, I want that person. I don't want that person. Or whatever, right? So people were kind of in that same place. If we go here, now they had to go where their tribe was, right? You couldn't have, different tribes moving around within the tribe, but they're like, if we're going to follow him as king, I want to know what it's going to be like, okay? So, 1 Kings 12, jump to the next chapter, 16 through 24. All right, 16 through 24. This is where the kingdom is first divided. Okay, everybody there? 1 Kings 12. Let's read backwards. Connor, would you start with 16 and then Micah and then Abby and go around?
So Jeroboam and all the people came to
No, 16.
Oh.
Chapter 16 of chapter 12, verse 16.
And when all Israel...
You're right.
And when all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, what portion do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel, look now to your own house, David. So Israel went to their tents,
Stop there. Stop there. Micah?
But Rehoboam reigned over the people of Israel who lived in the cities of Judah.
Then King Rehoboam sent Adorniah,
Sure.
who was taskmaster over the forced labor, and all Israel stoned him to death with stones. And King Rehoboam hurried to mount his chariot to flee to Jerusalem.
So Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day.
And when all Israel heard that Jeroboam had returned, they sent and called him to the assembly and made him king over all Israel. There was none that followed the house of David, but the tribe of Judah only.
When Rehoboam came to Jerusalem, he assembled all the house of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, 180,000 chosen warriors, to fight against the house of Israel, to restore the kingdom to Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. But the word of God came to Shemaiah, the son of God. Say to Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, king of Judah, and to all the house of Judah and Benjamin, and to the rest of the people.
Thus says the Lord, you shall not go up or fight against your relatives, the people of Israel. Every man return to his home, for this thing is from me. So they listened to the word of the Lord and went home again, according to the word of God.
Very good. So we've got this falling out between the two tribes. There's 10 tribes that want to follow with Jeroboam, and the two tribes, Judah and Benjamin, that follow with Rehoboam. So Jeroboam is king over Israel, the northern section, the biggest section, and Rehoboam, Solomon's son, king over the southern kingdom. Okay, everybody got that? Northern kingdom, southern kingdom, Jeroboam, Rehoboam. I don't know how you want to remember that, but that's kind of how it walks through. So we've got Jeroboam, and then we've got a series of kings. If you guys are looking at the timeline, you've got Nadab and Baasha and Elah and Zimri and Tibni and Omri as they go through there. Every one of them in the northern kingdom, at least on that page right there, every one of them worship pagan gods. Right? So they had fallen well away from worship of God, and there were consequences for that. And we're going to kind of walk through those a little bit now. All right? So at the bottom there in that brown box that we just read that section, when we look at that, how did the people respond to the choices of kings? Right? Let's just jot that down. How did the people respond to Rehoboam being king of the southern kingdom and Jeroboam being king of the northern kingdom? What did they do? And to give you a hint, verse 24, God stopped it. What did they do when Jeroboam became king of the north, Rehoboam king of the south?
Didn't Rehoboam and Jeroboam try and fight each other to get control of all of them?
Exactly. They had a small battle or a war. So when it says how did the people respond, they fought each other. Right? They fought each other. Now, you understand, if these are God's people, and God's plan for having people was what? Why did God have a people? Why did he choose the Hebrews as his people, Andrew?
Because that's where Jesus would come later, and they wanted the Hebrews to spread out and tell the words to everybody.
Okay, so let's say, for instance, I tell you guys I have an important phone call, so I go upstairs and to my office. It's up at the top of the stairs. And about 5 minutes later, I send for Landry, and Landry comes up, and I said, I want you to go down and tell everybody in class that they can go home because I'm going to be on the phone for a while. Okay? Landry is my spokesperson, right? So she comes and she represents me telling you all that you can go home because I'm going to be gone for a while. Okay? The Hebrews are God's people. They're not special opposed from any other people. They're not different in their sin. They're not different in necessarily their giftedness. They are simply God's representatives. So when God came to the Hebrews, when God came and when Jesus was born as a Jew, that wasn't what made the Jews special. What made them special was that God said, I have a special job for you. God came to save all people, but who's going to hear the message? A group of people that says, now, go tell everybody. Okay? When Jesus had his disciples, he said, first I want you to go tell all the Jews that I'm the Messiah. And then later, a guy by the name of Saul, who changes his name, gets his name changed to Paul. God goes to Paul and says, guess what your job is? You go to everybody outside the Jews and tell them that I'm the Messiah. Right? So that idea that God says, I'm going to choose these people to go and do this. So if we've got the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom fighting each other, God says, that's not my goal. These are my people. The goal is for them to shine the light, so to speak, of who I am to this world. So if you're busy fighting, it's over. I gotta pick different people or whatever. Instead, what he says, no, stop your fighting. You guys go to the north. You guys go to the south. And I know God doesn't do this in the Bible, but I bet he wanted to come down to earth and stand in front of him and go, this is why I told you no kings. This is exactly why. Right? Because look what's happening. You had Solomon, started out as a good king, ended a terrible king. I told Solomon, one wife. 1,000 seemed like a good idea to him. Right? Or at least 1,000 women, right? And all of this. So, God's over and over again going, this is why I said, get rid of the Canaanites. This is why I said no kings. This is why I said listen to me. Right? And so as this breaks apart and breaks down, that's what we see. So we don't have to answer those other two. I think we have. Underneath Jeroboam, all right, look at the one right next to that brown box. It says, right after Jeroboam became king in the north, he did something wicked. And like Solomon, he built idols and temples to worship false gods throughout his new kingdom. Now, we were already kind of hinted at the fact that Jeroboam is not going to be a godly king, right? But let's look there. We ended up on verse 24, so let's pick up just those 5. Bodie, would you read 2, Jace 2, Parker 1, start with verse 25, and just get us through 30.
Okay. Then Jeroboam built Shechem, the hill country of
Ephraim.
and lived there. And he went out from there and built
Penuel.
And Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom will turn back to the house of David.
If this people go up to offer sacrifices in the temple of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will turn again to their Lord, to Rehoboam king of Judah. And they will kill me and return to Rehoboam king of Judah. So the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold. And he said to the people, you have gone up to Jerusalem, honor the Lord your God of Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt.
And he set one in Bethel and the other in Bethlehem.
One more, Parker.
Then this thing became a sin, for the people went as far as Dan to be before God.
Okay, to be before one of the golden calves. Isn't it interesting that we've repeated this? Where did we see a golden calf before? Moses, right? He's up on the mountain receiving the 10 commandments from God. People are bored, right? They're like, we want a God. This God Yahweh doesn't have a form. We don't know what to bow down to. And so they said, we should make something. And Aaron, shame on him, said, okay, bring your gold and your jewelries and we'll melt it down and we'll make this calf. I don't know how big the calf was, but it was an object. That's what they wanted. They wanted an object to worship. So here it is again. It probably has some connection to the time of Moses. I don't know. But what Jeroboam is wrestling with is he said, listen, we're in the northern kingdom. Okay? The southern kingdom has Jerusalem in it. Okay, everybody follow? Northern kingdom, 10 tribes. Southern kingdom, it has Jerusalem in it. What's in Jerusalem that they spend a lot of time in? What structure? The temple. Solomon built it. It's enormous. It's elaborate. And so these 10 tribes up north, guess where they're going to want to go for the Passover and for the rituals and ceremonies? They're going to want to go to Jerusalem. So Jeroboam goes, well, if they go down to Jerusalem, where Rehoboam is king, then they're not going to want to be my subjects, and they'll end up leaving, and I'm afraid that I'm going to lose power. And he said, and if I go down there, I'll be killed. So I'm a rival king. Even though God said don't fight, it didn't mean that they loved each other. Right? Just kind of like your parents. If you have a sibling, right, and your parents kind of go, I want you to hug each other and tell each other you love each other. My mom used to do that for us boys. I grew up with a bunch of brothers. And so we'd hug and go, yeah, I love you. I can tell you, it didn't always mean anything. Right? Not always. Sometimes we were just like, as soon as mom's out of sight, yeah, we're wrestling again. Okay? And it's not right. It's not good, but true. Right? So what we recognize is, so what he does is he says, so to keep my people in the northern kingdom, I'm going to make these golden calves. You come worship them. Make a real big deal out of it. Very popular, right? And so people go, well, we won't travel down to Jerusalem because we've got these golden calves. We'll worship them, right? So even though it's a dumb idea by Jeroboam, that's what starts leading people away from worshiping God. Right? He says if they go down south to the southern kingdom, they'll stay there. They'll be loyal to Rehoboam, Solomon's son, and he talks about the house of David, as we kind of talked about. So in your own words, why did Jeroboam commit these sins? He was afraid of losing people. Jot that down. He was afraid of losing people, or subjects, if you want to put it that way. He was afraid of losing people or subjects. Underneath that paragraph, Jeroboam. So what do people today, right there next to the map in the middle there, what do people do today for popularity, even when it goes against what is right? How can we avoid falling into temptation like these? Guys, tell me, what do people do today for popularity? What do people do today for popularity? Anna Jo?
Like, go to talent shows and sing.
Yeah, it's express a talent, right? There's one thing. Jot it down. Jot it down. Express a talent, right? Now, let's start thinking about, well, I'll stretch that a little bit because let's talk about even when it goes against what is right. Let's say, for instance, your talent is something that doesn't exactly glorify God. Okay? So let's say the songs you sing are crude or vulgar or inappropriate, right? You guys probably have rules, I would think, of what music you can listen to, right? In your house, I would think, right? That there's certain things. I remember when I was growing up that there were certain styles of music. My folks were like, yeah, I don't want to hear those things. Those aren't good. That's not good music. Not just the style, but the words that are used. If there was profanity, swear words, things like that, right? What else might somebody do for popularity, even though it goes against what's right? What might somebody do for popularity? Landry?
Plastic surgery.
Was that?
Plastic surgery.
Plastic surgery, right. Okay, so what sin is being committed there? What would we call that? When you don't like the way you look and you want to look a different way, what do we call that? Kind of an old-fashioned word. Vanity. Vanity. Right? When you're vain, you're like, look how beautiful I am, or look how handsome I am. When I was working with youth back in the day, before I was a pastor of a church, I worked with high school youth and things like that. My youth used to ask me a question. Maybe you guys have wrestled with this too. They asked me once, they said, Pastor Eric, are tattoos wrong? Right? Getting a tattoo. That's actually very popular today. I can tell you, I don't have any tattoos. So obviously I have an opinion. Okay? Now, are they wrong in the eyes of God? That's a good question, right? So here's where I kind of come down on that. Again, it's not my opinion, more of a gauge on this. If a tattoo points to something other than God, that's vanity, right? That's an idol. Okay? So again, if like my daughter, you guys hang out with Megan, you guys have seen her, she has a tattoo on her wrist. Okay? And her tattoo is 3 nails that make the form of a cross. Right? I think that's about Jesus. Right? I think it's pretty safe. Now, she was old enough not to necessarily ask my permission for that tattoo, right? But I think if you're going to get a tattoo, this is not me promoting tattoos, again, pastor doesn't have any tattoos, okay? But if a tattoo glorifies God in some way, then I think maybe, you're in a better place than you would if you have some picture of a dragon or a woman or something else, or it's someplace on your body that doesn't need to see the light of day on a regular basis. Okay? So the point is that there are things that people do, and here in the northern kingdom they wrestle with this as well. They were doing something for popularity. Let's make some calves, golden calves to worship. But obviously it was wrong because it was idolatry. Okay? And yet, Jeroboam wanted to be popular as a king. All right, under Omri, let's read that. We're going to run a little bit shy on time tonight. Let me move going here. Omri, O-M-R-I, Omri became one of the most powerful kings in Israel. All right? He extended the border, created the new capital city, Samaria. By the way, somebody from Samaria, what would we call Samaritan. This is the beginning of the separation between the Jews and the Samaritans. Did they like each other? This is the beginning, right? Northern kingdom, southern kingdom. So when you guys start to get this idea of later on for Jesus, and this is, 700 years later now, about roughly for Jesus, and when the Jews don't like the Samaritans, it has to do with several centuries of animosity, anger, between the two kingdoms. Now we're going to learn, because I think Ada, you read this in the very beginning, the northern kingdom does get destroyed, right? It's not a banned by one king anymore. The Assyrians come in and take most of them away. So even though there's technically a space for the northern kingdom, it's not full, it's not covered by one king, and so there's really not a kingdom. But there is a town named Samaria, a region, and eventually there's people that are still settled there, and they don't like the Jews. And in Samaria, they build another temple. And it's a smaller temple, and they're like, well, we'll worship here. And then the Jews go, the only right place to worship is down here in Jerusalem. Okay? So it's like, there are people in churches, not this one, that might say this kind of worship service is the only right one, right? We like traditional worship with an organ and choir and hymnals, and the pastor wears a robe and so forth. You guys might have family or been to churches where that doesn't look like what the church is. There's a band that plays, and the pastor wears a bowling shirt and blue jeans, and it's a little different. And some people would go, this is the only right way to worship. That's kind of the way the Jews were about Jerusalem. They're like, this is the only right place to worship is this, and not that place. Okay? Maybe it was Samaria or something like that. All right. Kelly, do you need Bowie? All right. So Omri's one of the more popular, one of the more powerful kings, but because he's so bad that we see this, he's only given 2 verses in the Bible. Even though he was a powerful king, he wasn't a great king in the eyes of God. All right? So since he wasn't a great king, even though you could say the world would say he was bright and he was powerful, but he wasn't good in the eyes of God. We don't have to jot that down. That's fine. All right, other page, top of page 63. Elisha. God took Elijah to heaven in a fiery chariot. Does everybody know that story? Maybe from Sunday school, right? So Elisha is the student to Elijah, right? Elijah's older and so forth, and Elisha was his student. And Elisha, knows that it's his time to take over. And Elijah says, I'm going to be gone soon. And Elisha goes, well, I want to see you leave. And they have this discussion. And so he gets to see Elijah taken up to heaven in a fiery chariot. By the way, he's one of 2 people in the Bible that don't die. Right? They go to heaven without dying. Anybody know what the other one is? Take a guess.
Can't remember his name.
Begins with an E, ends in knock.
Enoch.
Well done. Thank you, Joe. Excellent. Yeah. So Enoch and Elijah are 2 that it isn't mentioned that they died. Now, here's a fascinating thing to think about. What's happening right now? I don't know. Because you know, not to get too deep and melancholy tonight, but when a person dies now, the body goes, decays, right? And so they're not up in heaven walking around. Hasn't been Judgment Day. There hasn't been the resurrection yet. That's all going to happen on Judgment Day. We're waiting, right? But not Elijah or Enoch. They're not waiting. Well, they're waiting, but they're not decayed bodies and things like that. Nothing but a soul. So it's just one of those interesting things to think about. Elisha took over as God's prophet. Remember, what's the job of a prophet to the northern kingdom? What's their job? They did the same thing over and over again. Spread the news. Specifically what news, Shiloh?
Messiah's coming?
The what?
Messiah is coming?
Well, yes, that's true. They would talk about that, but specifically to the kings and the people of the northern kingdom, what would have been the...
That God is our Father.
Well, what they would have done, they would have been warnings. They would have warned him. It's like, you guys are worshiping other things, golden calves, stuff like that. And the prophet's job. So what you talked about earlier, remember the cycle of the judges? Elijah was doing the same thing, and Elisha as well. God worked many miracles through Elisha, spoke his word to the kingdoms through whom the kings of Israel continued to worship false gods. And then they've got them there. Ahab, Ahaziah, Jehoram, Jehu, Jehoaz, Joash, Jeroboam the second, Zechariah, Shallum, and then a bunch of them there, Hoshea, all the way down. So Ahab, in this blue square here, let's just run that. One of the most famous and powerful narratives during the time of the northern kingdom has to do with Ahab, Elijah, and the prophets of Baal. King Ahab inherited a strong kingdom from his father Omri. So there's a mention of Omri again. Great king, powerful king, and he has a son named Ahab. And King Ahab, also a very godless man, and very evil. In fact, go to 1 Kings 16. Go there in your Bibles, please. 1 Kings 16, verse 29 through 34. Would somebody just volunteer just to read that section? Child, just read it all.
Which one is it?
16, 29 through 34.
In the 38th year as a king of Judah, Ahab the son of Omri began to reign over Israel, and Ahab the son of Omri reigned over Israel in Samaria 22 years. And Ahab the son of Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. And as it had been a light thing for him to walk in the signs of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, he took for his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of Sidon, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. He erected an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he built in Sam. And Ahab made an Asherah. Ahab did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger all the kings of Israel who were before him. In his days, healed Bethel, built Jericho. He laid its foundation at the cost of Abram, his firstborn, and set up its gates at the cost of his youngest son, Segub, according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke by Joshua the son of Nun.
So there's a mention of Joshua again there. So what it basically says is that Ahab did more evil in his life than any king before him. So if you look at that timeline, right, everybody before him is like, he's the worst of them all so far. Right? So that timeline, he's the worst king of them all. And evil in the eyes of God. Not just a bad king, but evil, right, in the things that he did by worshiping, what he did to people, and so forth. So Elijah shows up. This is chapter 17 and forward. Elijah shows up with a message from God. Elijah says, Ahab, until you straighten up and follow God's commands, there's going to be a drought, and it's going to be severe. Now, a drought means what? No water. Now, if you have no water, what else gets affected? No food. If there's no food, what else gets affected?
Life.
All life. That's right. Yeah, there's no plants, there's no things that eat plants, no things that eat those things, and so everything pays the price. So now water is hard to come by. You got to travel long distance to get food and so forth. And so they're really suffering. Cool little miracle. Elijah comes upon a widow in Zarephath, and she's there and she's suffering because of the drought, and she's about to die. And Elijah shows up and says, "Dear woman, I would like a cake of bread and some water." And she goes, "I have barely any water, and we have a little bit of oil and a little bit of flour. And I'm going to feed it to my son and myself, and then we're going to lie down and die." So they've been starving. This is the last bit of food that they're going to have. And it says, and Elijah goes, yeah, I get that. Would you please make me a cake of bread and some water, right? And she's like, fine. Because it was the proper thing to do, right? And so she does. Pours the oil out and puts the flour in it, mixes it up, puts it on top of the fire, hot stone, makes a little cake, and gives it to Elijah and goes, there you go. And he says, why don't you make some for yourself? And it's like, well, that's all I have. Pours it out, there's more oil inside. Pours out the flour, more flour inside, makes a cake. And the next day, same thing, it's there. It doesn't run out. And so just God's way of kind of saying, as you honor my messenger, which not many people did for the prophets, right? They didn't honor them. She does, and there's a reward for it. And Joe?
I'm guessing it like ran out one day, or it was still be on earth.
Once the drought was over, it makes sense that it would, right? It was God's way of saying, because you obeyed or honored my representative, by proxy, you were honoring God. And so that was the reward. You're right. I'm sure there's not a little flask somewhere in the Middle East that they're like, watch this. It's still coming out, you know. I get it. So then Elijah, then the son dies, unfortunately, due to an illness. And through another miracle, Elijah raises him back to life. And so there's not a resurrection, because that happens on Judgment Day, a resuscitation that brings him back to life. Then Elijah finally comes back to the northern kingdom, comes upon Ahab. Ahab says, basically to Elijah, you're a dead man walking, right? Because you're the cause of this drought. All this suffering is going is your fault. And he just basically says, your beef is with God. And he says, so I've come here to show you what's going to happen as a result of that. And so what he does, he has this showdown, and I love this story. The showdown between the prophets of Baal and Elijah. So what he does is he says, we're going to have a competition. This Sunday is the Super Bowl, right? I often call this story the Super Baal, right? Because Baal was the god they worship, and then Elijah obviously is the only one that worships God. And then there's all of the Hebrews that are following Ahab, right? They're getting bad leadership. And so he says, listen, we're going to build 2 altars. We're going to butcher 2 bulls, big animals, right? And you're going to prepare it for a burnt offering. But you can't put fire to it. You got to pray to God. Your God is Baal. My God is Yahweh. And whoever sends fire down on earth to burn up the bull and the altar, that's who we're going to worship. Okay? And so they do that. And there's hundreds of prophets of Baal. Cut up the bull, put it on top of the altar, and they begin to dance around and call out to Baal. Now, you realize they're dancing around to nobody. Because Baal's not a real god. Okay? Other than Satan's influence, there's no such thing as Baal. And so Elijah, and I appreciate real human character in this, Elijah starts to mock them. Right? He starts to make fun of them. He says, yell a little louder, maybe your God is hard of hearing. And so they start to dance, and they begin to cut themselves, right, to kind of go, look, Baal, we care so much about you, we're so loyal to you, we're going through this self-mutilation just so that you'll send fire down to prove your power. And Elijah goes, you all are crazy, right? And then he says, and this is kind of crude, so I apologize, but it's the story. He says, maybe Baal is in the bathroom relieving himself. He says it a little bit differently than that, but that's the message, right? Maybe he's busy, right? You got to come back in 10 minutes when he's not relieving himself in God bathroom, wherever that is, right? And obviously nothing happens, and all the Baal prophets kind of exhausted, they kind of collapse. Nothing happens. And so Elijah goes to his altar where his bull has been butchered and set up on the side, and he says, I want you to take these great pots, and I want you to fill them with water. I want you to pour them over the offering, right? The bull. And then I want you to build a trough around the outside. I want you to keep pouring bucket after bucket of water on this until it fills up this trough. So what basically is saying is his altar is soaking wet. And you're like, that won't burn. Okay? And so he prays a prayer. He says, God, so that everyone around knows that you are supreme. He says, win this battle. And fire comes down from heaven. Not only burns up the bull, but the wood, the stones that it is sitting on, and even the water that it's in there is just wicked up. So there's nothing but a big black scorch mark, right? And then Elijah turns to the rest of the Hebrews that have been following Ahab, and they said, it's done, right? All this sinning and rebellion. Now, destroy the prophets of Baal. And so they turn on the prophets of Baal, they run them down, and they slaughter them, right? It's kind of gross, pretty graphic, but they do. And then the queen Jezebel, who is Ahab's wife, I don't know if you guys ever heard of Jezebel. We use that word to call somebody a not nice name. When you're kind of conniving and maybe evil, we'll go, she's a Jezebel. I've never heard it referred to as a guy, but we call people a Jezebel when it's not a very nice term. Okay? Kind of like if anybody ever calls somebody a Benedict Arnold, right? You're somebody that's turning, you're just using a name from history and so forth. Anyhow, so she chases him and he runs, which is crazy. He just saw this incredible miracle, and now he's afraid. And he runs and he goes and hides in a cave. Maybe you guys know this story where God says, I want you to come and hear my voice. And he comes out on the front of the cave, and there's an earthquake, right? And God says, that wasn't me. That was just an earthquake. And there's a great fire, And he's like, that wasn't me. That was just a fire. And then there's this great wind that even splits rocks. And God goes, that wasn't me. That was just great wind. And then there's this quiet breeze. And God says, that's me. And that's when Elijah starts to learn to listen, right, for the quiet voice of God. So, cool story about the altar and things like that. Then the last one, I'll finish up with this one. Hoshea, that last little bit on the very end of our timeline. Hoshea was the last king of the northern kingdom. Now, from what we read in the very beginning, what Ada read, what happens at the end of the northern kingdom? What finally ends the northern kingdom?
They get attacked.
They get attacked. The Assyrians come in and take them away, and you know, all the way to the end. In fact, my adult Bible class is talking about Daniel right now being whisked off to Babylon. This is where this is headed in this way. So just kind of all connects. All right, guys, that's where we'll end for today. For those of you watching the video, pay attention for your assignment. It's going to be coming up in just a second. But for you guys tonight, no assignment for you tonight. I will see you guys next week. Ready to roll? All right, God bless you guys.